I'm going to start with some questions, and then we do have some radio mics. And I hope when you want to ask a question, don't look at me, grab one of them, rugby tackle them, whatever you need to do. It's just easier because we don't have one of those question time booms. And I want to try and avoid that thing where someone puts their hand up and we all wait for 5 minutes while the radio mic gets to them. So I'll try and follow the mics when we come to open it up to a wider discussion. We've just been standing backstage swapping Tom Spanbauer stories, so I wanted to start by going back to Tom's Kitchen and just asking you to talk a bit about the way that influenced you as a writer and helped you find a way of writing that was yours.
I had been in a workshop before Tom's workshop, and it was a workshop of very nice middle-aged ladies. And I was bringing in kind of dark material. There's a scene in Snuff where a character buys a blow-up doll that's modeled after his favorite porn actress, who might also be his mother. It's like a Greek tragedy, isn't it? And he dresses it and styles it so it looks exactly like the porn actress. And then he goes about seducing it. And as he's undoing the zipper in the back of its dress, he's apparently snagged its skin. And as he's having intercourse with it, it's gradually losing air, and he's realizing that this wrinkling and shriveling and kind of aging into this hideous mummy as he's trying to get off. And he's going faster and faster trying to achieve his aims. And at the end, his real mother walks into the room as he jumps up with this big pink flag hanging from his erection, which is what's left of the doll. That was part of an earlier book that I presented to the Nice Lady workshop. And the nice lady who was in charge of the workshop took me aside and said, "We really don't want you here anymore. There are nice ladies who don't feel safe." But she said, "There's this man named Tom Spanbauer." And the Nice Lady workshop was okay. I mean, it kept me writing. But it was really just about hand-holding. It didn't give me any kind of rules or skills, anything that kind of constrained me. And as soon as I walked into Tom's workshop, Tom had 1,000 rules that he learned from Gordon Lish. No Latinase, no adverbs, no thought verbs, no dream sequences. Don't even think about bringing a dream sequence in. Speak in burnt tongue. Reinvent the language by doing it wrong. You've got to stay with the same themes, the same elements, the same characters, the same settings throughout the entire book. Tom calls it horses. He had all of these rules about dentals. Always try to end a story or end every sentence with a dental. But probably they're not. That's the short story of Fight Club ends with the word "not" because it ends with a dental. These hard dentals instead of soft sounds, really focusing on dentals. And Tom came from a performing background. He was part of the Bowery Lane Players in New York. And so he made us perform our work, he made us read our work at workshop. And that also constrained the length of the work. But Tom said, make it 7 pages. Make me laugh, break my heart, and do it inside of, at most, 10 pages. And so Tom had all of these rules. And as young people, you want rules. I wanted rules. I did not want, this is great, bring it back. I really enjoyed this. I didn't want opinion. I wanted rules. And Tom gave us 1,000 rules, and it was just so fantastic to be told what I couldn't do. It really focused me on what I should be doing. So that was there were so many rules.
And one of Tom's rules was very much about, or is very much about, writing as close to the body as you can, which that story is a perfect embodiment of.
Going on the body.
Yeah.
That was
Talk a bit about
that. There's an old saw, an old saying in writing. If you don't know what comes next, describe the interior of the character's mouth. Because it is such a sympathetically physical place. And Tom knew that periodically throughout a narrative, as you're kind of switching between different textures of information, another Tom distinction was big voice. Big voice is where I switch in guts to most of the last peak in teen suicide was just kids trying to choke themselves while they beat off. A big observational statement, as opposed to what Tom would call a little voice narrative statement, where you're just being what Tom would call the recording angel, and just depicting the physical scene. So ideally, you're constantly switching textures between big voice and little voice, and then going on the body, where you're describing a really specific physical sensation, or you're using a chorus to refer back to. 1 minute, you're just a kid getting off, and the next minute, you'll never be a lawyer. That's a chorus that revisits that callback humor and keeps every moment of the story present in every subsequent moment. So it doesn't have a kind of one-of linear quality. It has more of a cumulative quality. Tom would say like a symphony, which starts with a simple melody. That's minimalism. You start with one melody, and then you vary the melody, you build the melody, but that melody is never entirely gone. And at the end, when every instrument in the orchestra is playing, that melody is still present. And so on the body is just another one of those sort of textures or those elements that you keep bringing back in as you need it to keep varying that texture.
But sometimes there's a possibility that Tom's classes can seem a bit like therapy from the outside, because the other big thing is about starting from the point which is most painful for you as a person, not just as a writer, but as a person. Now, where does that come from in terms of you as a writer? I mean, where do you go to start these amazing tales that you tell?
Well, and Tom's rationale, from the very first session when you go into his workshop, he says, write about something that's very threatening and upsetting to you, because there's no guarantee that your work will ever sell. You may never be recognized or acknowledged in any way for what you're doing here. So you should at least get some sort of catharsis or sort of a gestalt exploration of this issue in your life. Find a metaphor and completely explore and unpack that issue, so that even if you never sell it, you're a better person. Plus that unresolved sort of hot button issue will keep you coming back to the work, because you have a really emotional stake in it. You really have an investment in it. There's something in it that's really scary but really engaging for you. And that in itself will keep you coming back. The other thing, we're going to talk about Tom all night.
No.
Tom says that 99% of what any workshop does is just give you permission and license to write. It legitimizes a pastime that the rest of the world doesn't see as valid. When I worked at Freightliner, I made the mistake of telling people that I was studying writing. And all of these guys would always kind of elbow up next to me and say, how's that little writing thing going? How's that little writing thing going? Can you get the New York Times bestseller list? I just hated those bastards. I hated them so much. But that kept me writing. And Tom's legitimizing that pastime and putting me among a pool of people every week who also love that pastime, kept us all writing.
Now, whenever, when she was alive, my mother saw things that I'd done, whether they were plays or stories, she always used to say, why do you want to think or spend time with such terrible things? I think Chuck Palahniuk would come pretty high on her list of terrible things. And you do push text in extraordinary way into extraordinary areas. But you also say in the non-fiction work this thing like, a good story works if it changes how you feel. It brings you a greater appreciation, a greater joy of your existence. And I'm really interested in the corollary between the kind of subject matter that you push all the time, and that joy of existence.
There's really no sense in triumph in doing the things that you know you can do. I know I can do this thing, so if I go and do it, you know, what's the success in that? What's the victory? But if I set off and do a thing that I have no idea if I can do it, or even if I really want to do it, there's something there that is just really a feeling. And in writing the gut story, it wasn't the story itself that really challenged me. It was the idea that if I was going to read this story, people were going to collapse me with the narrator. And forgive me, I told this story last night in Sheffield, but I'm going to tell it again. At the first public reading in San Francisco where I read that story, there was this long autographing line afterwards, and a very elegantly dressed elderly Asian woman came up with like a 12-year-old boy who obviously had bullied her to bring him to this event. And as they got to me, this is going to sound terrible, okay? So racist. As they got to me, and she was really beautifully dressed, she goes, I tell my grandson, don't you never stick nothing up your penis. This is in front of like 600 people, and this poor kid. But at the same event, a woman my age took me aside later and said, do you know what brownies are? Brownies, they're like a precursor to Girl Guides or Girl Scouts.
I thought it was going to be something much more terrible.
It will be. It's getting there. You can't start with terrible. She said, when I was in second grade, when I was 7 years old, I was a brownie. And one day I had a stomachache. And this would have been she was my age, so it would have been in 1969. And she said our family had this heating pad with a vibrating function. And my mom kept me home from school while she went to work. And she put me to bed with this heating pad. And as I fell asleep, it must have slid down between my legs. Because when I woke up, I was experiencing this sensation, this vibrating hot sensation that I had never felt before. It was extraordinary. And so the next time it was my turn to host the brownies, I said, brownies, you've got to try this heating pad. And all the little brownies, she said, they just rode that heating pad all afternoon. They just fought over it. It was like Sex in the City for 7-year-old girls. She said the best part of it was that for the first time, she was the most popular girl in the second grade. Everybody wanted to be her best friend. Everybody wanted to play at her house. All the brownie meetings were at her house. She said, until the day my mom came home from work early and caught me with the brownies and the heating pad and sent the brownies home and just whipped that cord out of the wall, pulled it out of the socket, and just started to beat me. And just beat me. And the whole time she beat me with this cord, she said, you fucking dirty slut, you fucking piece of shit, you dirty whore. What kind of a fucking slutty whore am I raising? And she beat me, and she beat me, and she beat me. And this woman goes, you know, I haven't had an orgasm since I was 7 years old. But if you can tell that story about how you were disemboweled by a swimming pool filter. And you can make people laugh about that? She says, I bet I can make my heating pad story funny. Too late, I already did. And maybe, eventually, I can tell that story and tell that story until it doesn't make me cry, and I can go back to my mom in Coos Bay and say, you remember that heating pad we used to have? And I can resolve this in my life. I had not had a radical bowel resectioning. If it meant getting back to 130 pounds, I'd consider it. But writing the gut story, I knew that standing up there, I was not going to be some big hero. I was going to be some big humiliated thing. And I think that's much more powerful to demonstrate as you're presenting something. Because it gives everybody that permission to be that humiliated thing, which we periodically have to be. And then to be able to write about it, make it funny, express it, and use it instead of being used by it. Blah, blah, blah. Next question.
Well, I'm going to open it up now, and while one of you grabs the microphone, just ask one last question myself, so line someone up for this. We've talked very much about the personal sphere, but one thing, or the other thing that really strikes me about your work is this, it's always set in the world, you're really against the world, it's pushing against the world all the time, first in transgressional literature, in a different way in the stuff that you're doing now. And I've heard people talk, and you talk about how 9/11, or you write about how 9/11 changed the kind of public dimension of your writing. I wonder if you could just talk a bit more about that.
Boy, 9/11, they talk about it being the death of irony. I think it was like the death of subtlety. That you could have a transgressional novel, like Train Spotting, or American Psycho, or The Monkey Wrench Gang, or Fight Club, and it could be a political novel like Clockwork Orange. But now, transgression no longer has a kind of sympathy as a political act. It's too easily lumped into terrorism. So there's no humor around it, there's no reception for it anymore. And I think that we have to do what we did in the 50s, which is kind of present that kind of social criticism through genre. It's got to be science fiction or horror. Rosemary's Baby, Ira Levin, he was so smart. The Stepford Wives predicted Susan Faluti's Backlash 20 years earlier. They should have given that Pulitzer Prize to Ira Levin, because he told that story far better than Susan Faludi. She's a friend of mine, but boy, Ira Levin really was all over social issues. Rosemary's Baby is all about a woman's right for reproductive choice. But nobody wanted to talk about that in 1966. Now, no way. So we'll talk about the story about this woman getting knocked up by the devil and having no control over, how her body is used and for medical treatment and being forced to fulfill this thing. So I don't think that that's a bad thing. I don't think that it's bad that transgressional fiction has to leave the stage for a little bit, and that we have to be a little more charming and funny or scary with our metaphors. I think in a way it's even more effective.
Okay, let's open it up. Both people want to join the conversation.
Hi, Joe. I was just wondering, do you try and write every day?
Yeah, I do. Actually, I write every day. I don't keyboard every day, but I take notes. And I always carry my work in a kind of working hardcover. I've always done it this way. It was so I could work on fiction at work. I would have these folders that were filled with schematics and wiring diagrams and everything I needed for my job. But at the very heart of all of that would be a chapter of Fight Club. so that I could turn to that and line edit it. And when I got a chance to go back to my computer, I could make those changes. But that's still how I work, because it's in the big world as you're living and you're around people that you're going to see just exactly the right gesture that you needed for that one point in the story. That beat of physical action, or that perfect descriptive phrase, or that perfect transitional phrase. And you're only going to hear that in the wider world. So that's why I carry my work with me at all times. So that if someone once said, I hate going to auctions. No, I hate rap music because it sounds like I'm at an auction. I thought, what a clever way of putting it. I haven't used it, but I still remember it. And so that's how I write every day, is longhand, usually within a half-finished draft.
You mentioned about draft and editing that. Hello? When do you know when to stop writing? When do you know when to stop editing? And to extend on that, if you had the chance to go back to any of your stories, would you change anything?
My father gave my brother and I a sex talk once. This is how it went. He said, never date a redhead. They're trouble. They're all fucked up. They're crazy. And he said, never dump the one you're with until you're dating the next one. And so part of what completes a previous work is how much I start falling in love with the next work. And that way, when I bring something to market, my heart's not still attached to this thing that's coming to market. It might be torn to shreds, might not be received well. My heart is attached to the next thing. So I'm always, no. When my grandmother was diagnosed with breast cancer in the early 80s, and she was so sure that she was going to die, that she contacted each of her grandchildren, and she said, what are your 3 favorite colors? And we say, why? And she said, don't ask. And we said, why? And she said, I have cancer, I'm going to die. I want to make each of you an Afghan. I'm going to crochet you an Afghan in your 3 favorite colors, so that you have something to remember me by. And then she didn't die. And years later, she came by my apartment and she saw that Afghan and she was so embarrassed. She goes, oh God, let me make you another one. Let me make you a better one. And in a way, that's how I am about my books. It's like, oh, why would I go back to Fight Club? I can make you a better one. I'll make you a better one. And so I really don't look back. I really don't second guess them. I fall in love with the next one. And just keep moving forward.
Hi, I was just wondering which of your books was the most emotionally invested for you to write? Which one was the hardest?
Oh, God. Thanks for scraping the scab off that one. My friend Susie, who has been my friend since 1990 when I started in Tom Spanbauer's workshop. Susie wrote a story once about her septic field failing at her farmhouse, and within a week, her septic tank overflowed and the field failed. There's this weird, horrible magic, like somehow you're getting a premonition of something that's about to happen. And you write it into fiction, and somehow it instantly happens. I don't know, it's just spooky, it's horrible. And I wrote this book called Fight Club. And in 1999, it was made into a movie. And in it, a man is shot to death by a crazy man. And in 1999, my father was shot to death by a crazy man. right at the time that Fight Club was supposed to be released. My father was murdered. And in 2008, I'd written this other book called Choke, about a son trying to care for his mother who was dying at a fairly early age. And in 2008, the movie of Choke came out. And at exactly the same time, my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. So I was caring for my mother while I was coming to London to do promotion for the Choke movie. And there is this weird relationship between what you write and how it somehow happens in the world, whether somehow you're anticipating it or causing it, God knows. All I know is my sister now says, don't you ever write about me. But last year, when I was putting the finishing touches on this year's book, Doomed, I wrote the scene in which her kitten dies. And the kitten swells up and will not eat, refuses to eat, and eventually dies. And within a couple of weeks of writing those scenes, my dog, which I love more than anything in the world, my little dog, quit eating. And it was terrible. I mean, I was trying to cram food down her throat because I didn't want her to die. And she ended up dying of the thing that I had written the cat was dying of. And my editor came back to me and said, no, the cat part is just heartbreaking. You cannot kill this little cat. That's just too sad and upsetting. And I said, no, that's just how my dog died. It has to stay. Because it so predicted my dog's death. It was just uncanny. And so that was just a fantastically painful thing that went into the book before it happened, and then had to stay in the book after that. Yeah.
Helen, in your books you've approached a lot of subjects that people would maybe find controversial or shocking. Are there any subjects that you've thought about but not approached because you were maybe not fully happy exploring or just felt it was too far?
That's amazing. That is amazing.
No. It becomes kind of like was it Kierkegaard's idea of dread? That if you can conceive of something, you have to make it happen. That if I get an idea, I have to find some way of depicting that idea and bringing it about before I can be free of it. That until I do so, for years and years, every time I got on an airplane, I said, please God, don't crash this airplane. Because I've got 3 really good, funny stories about masturbation. I've got the candle story, which happened to my best friend in college, who was not 13, who was 27. And he'd been in the Iraq War, and he'd come back knowing about that Princess Wand thing. Oh. And I had the carrot story, which had happened to another friend of mine, who had to get blind drunk. And I'm the only person he ever told the carrot story to. And he was there the first night I read it in public. And the look on his face. I just wanted to stop and say, Graham, they're not going to know it was you. But there's this kind of this burden of having possession of these 2 things that has such value, but I knew I needed a third thing. I needed a third anecdote that would increase that situation to a kind of really dramatic crescendo. And while I was researching Choke, I was going to sexual compulsive meetings. And those people are fascinating. Oh my God. Better than anything on TV. The stories. And there was this one guy who was fantastically thin. I said, how do you do it? And he said, I've only got 6 inches of large intestine. And he told me the swimming pool story that's happening to him. And I said, okay, I've got my third thing. So if I know about it, if I can conceive of it, in a way I have to act on it, or it's this big unresolved burden. And so right now, no, I don't got any big unresolved ideas like that.
Hi Chuck, I teach film studies, and one of the areas the students look at is auteur, and David Fincher's version of Your Fight Club is one of the films they have to study. I just wondered how much input you get into film adaptations, and whether you feel sometimes when someone like Fincher is held as an auteur, does that take away from your own acclaim as a writer in that case?
When you're involved in maybe in other films you get more control, more input. But if you're involved in a film with David Fincher and Edward Norton, oh my God. The battling 2 giant egos, I was just glad to be outside of the blast zone. Just it's fine, you know. Yeah, Edward, I think that sounds great. Let's do it your way. You know, David, I think that sounds great. Let's do it your way. I really just completely agreed with both of them. And then I was going to side with whoever survived.
Because they made you change your mind, didn't you? I want to have your abortion plan.
Yeah. Brad Pitt, that's actually that line where Marla says, because the impetus for the line was I wanted Marla to say the least romantic thing she could say after they had sex for the first time. And the most romantic thing would be, I want to have your baby. So the inverse. And Brad Pitt got that line. And he said, my mother's going to see this movie. He said that. He said, my mother in Illinois is going to see this movie. And she's really going to be put off by that. So they floated a whole bunch of trial lines. And they came up, David Fincher came up with, I haven't been fucked like that since grade school. And Laura Ziskin at 20th Century Fox said, could we change it back to the abortion line?
Do you have any more? Yeah, up there.
Hi. Rand is my favourite book, and I was just wondering where your inspiration came from for that and how it came about. I'm up here. Hello.
Yeah, I know.
This is the thinking zone. I've got all the answers written down.
Telepathically answer your questions. The inspiration for a rant. I was raised in a completely desolate set. I mean, they make the moors look like the rainforest. I was raised in this desert that is nothing but isolated cactus and very, very small communities. There were 600 people in my community. And it was such a different life than the life I have now. It really was a life about being out in the natural world, you know, with scorpions and rattlesnakes and coyotes and cattle. It really was a completely natural, arid landscape. And at the time I was writing Rant, I wanted to, in some way, kind of remember and document that part of my life that I was just starting to forget. My brother and I used to roll over rocks and try to catch scorpions and get bit. We got bit by a lot of scorpions. And black widow spiders, just a lot of venomous insects. And at the same time, I was really developing this huge phobia about car accidents. I was so terrified of car accidents. I'd never really been in one, but I was becoming more and more too nervous to drive. And so I thought one way to deal with that in a dangerous writing way is to Fight Club works because it takes one of your worst fears and it allows you a kind of gestalt setting in which to explore that fear. A consensual, structured setting where you're with someone you trust and you say, I want you to hit me as hard as you can. So you have a way to explore your reaction to violence. You have a way to be violent and to experience violence in a way that will give you some, relief around this anxiety about violence. So I wanted to create a consensual, structured form of car accidents that would be more like a game, like play. And so that's where Rant came from. The idea of kind of doing Fight Club, but with cars. And of kind of setting the character's life where I grew up in the middle of nowhere.
Sorry, just a sec. We have time for a few more questions, but if anyone on the balcony wants to ask them in a loud voice, I don't want to be excluded just because you're not sitting near a mic person. So who's shouting out? Sorry.
I was wondering, out of any of your books what haven't been adapted into films yet, is there any in particular that you'd like to see made into a film, and why would that be?
I never really anticipate any of my books being made into a film because every time I sit down to write, I always think, what is the strength of this medium? What can books do that movies and TV can't do? Because those people get paid so much more money than I do that I want to do the thing that they can't do. And whenever I'm around well-known actors, they always take a chance to come over to me and say, you know what I really dream of doing? I dream of writing novels. Because you guys can do anything. I have to do with the producer, the screenwriter, with the director, with the financing people. I have to do everything that people tell me to do. I have no freedom whatsoever in my craft. But you as a novelist, you have all the freedom I ever dreamed of. And they have all the money I ever dreamed of. So I always think, what is it that you can't do on TV? You can't make a feature film of. You can't show on an airplane. And that's the thing I set out to do. And because of that, I never really anticipate my work becoming a film. If it does, that's fine, but I have really no expectation or investment that it will. So I really don't have an attachment to that.
Tom's roles, or at least the ones you've spoken about in both on writing and in various interviews, are undoubtedly effective, and you've applied them time and time again to great result. And they've lent you a certain structure in your work. You're defined by the roles to a certain aspect. Various discussions on 4chan and other online forums about you being between genre and literary, somewhere in between, somewhere in that sort of gap. How do you feel about the idea of your work being formulaic and verse, chorus, verse versus sort of writing as a craft and trying to expand the genre, or expand the medium rather?
Well, you didn't think that Pygmy was weird enough? The next year's book, Next Year's Girlfriend, thank you, Dad, violates every one of Tom's rules. When I was little, I must have been asked to put away some folded laundry or something, because in my father's clothes closet I found these paperback books that were called things like Gestapo Pussy Ranch. And you can imagine the kind of whip-wielding covers they had. And they were on paper that was like cheaper than toilet paper. Just the pulpiest, nastiest paper. And I love those books. They didn't make sense to me. They were like poetry because I had no idea what they were talking about. I was maybe 6 years old, I could barely read. But you know, they weren't written for a rocket scientist. Just really simple verb, verb, verb. You can imagine what those verbs were. I love those books. And so I thought, why not try to write one of those really graphic, explicit novels, but using all the euphemisms that Barbara Cartland would use. So it's like the Marquis de Sade and Barbara Cartland had a baby. Adverbs, Latinates, dream sequences, everything that Tom said not to do goes in the next year's book. And it was a joy. And the language is so elaborate and so ludicrous in depicting the horrific things it depicts. It really is, the novel is really a crime against humanity. So maybe next year's book. Beautiful You.
Okay, I think we have time for two more. There's one here.
Hello. Hello, Chuck.
Sorry, here.
I'm over here. Sorry. What is your relationship to music with regards to your writing?
I used to do a kind of Andy Warhol trick. Warhol would put a 45 on a record player and play it endlessly on repeat. There's accounts of him listening to this song called I Saw Linda Yesterday until the needle actually wore through the record. And it was a way of kind of putting himself into a trance and breaking down the language like a 3-minute mantra that played endlessly. And I used to do that. I would do that with Radiohead songs, Creep for the book Choke. I did that with 9 Inch Nails for Fight Club. I did that with Billy Idol, Dancing with Myself for Pygmy. But I quit doing that with Damned and Doomed, the two most recent books, and with Beautiful You, because I found that I wanted my language to become more and more elaborate. Part of keeping language simple was due to Tom. Tom would always advocate for really, really simple language. You know, just use the word big. Just say big. Just say really instead of enormous. Keep your language really, really simple. And also because in my family, if your language was very elaborate, you were considered pretentious. And it is kind of an American thing that we had to be kind of, what's her name, Palin. It had to be very Palin Bush in my family, in our language. That if you ever spoke above a certain kind of vocabulary, you were considered getting above yourself and pretentious, and you needed to cut it out. And so, since my parents are dead, my language is gradually kind of becoming more and more elaborate. And subsequently, I don't listen to music anymore when I write, just because I want the language to be the music.
Last question, please.
Do you think successful writers are born or made? Okay.
Tom's theory, one of the first things Tom says is that writers write because they weren't invited to a party. When he says that, it's one of those true things that you think, yeah, there was something that I wasn't included in, some heating pad incident. And I've kind of labeled myself as an outcast ever since then. But I think it's impossible to say whether it's kind of social modeling or whether it's something genetic. No idea. I just know that my parents modeled reading for us a lot. And when, I remember when we had children's books that were worn out, really were falling apart. And as a child, I would go to throw them away. My mother would say, "We never throw a book away. Books are just too precious. We keep all of our books. Books are more valuable than money." And so books had this really revered status in our household. But at the same time, this is so evil. This is what you can look forward to when your parents are dead. The sense that you can tell stories on them. Summers were fantastically hot where I grew up. It would be over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 110, 112. So during the middle of the day, typically you would hide inside with a book. You would read. And there were summer days when my mother would kick me out of a chair with a paperback book, like a Ray Bradbury book. She'd kick me out of a chair and she'd say, "Go do something. Nobody's ever going to pay you to read and write books." I know, she's dead. So there was that kind of dichotomy that books were precious, but that writing books was beyond our class of people. And that was another kind of miracle thing about meeting Tom, is that Tom had come from New York to Portland, Oregon, and I had never met an actual writer until I met Tom. And just meeting Tom physically made writing a physical possibility. I can see for the first time that it wasn't like gods wrote books and just sent them from New York. Which is what I really thought. That real people wrote books. And meeting Tom was such a wonderful proof that in itself, that was the license to write, is this proof that real people could do this. So maybe I argue that they're made. Writers are made. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we need to finish that. It's a great shame we've gone for a long time. I think it's, for me, a marvellous irony that on the evening of Children in Need, we have the creator of Madison Spencer. It's been a great pleasure to have you in Hull. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for coming, ladies and gentlemen. Chuck Palahniuk.